A reading of the Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 5th chapter. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." The Gospel of the Lord. Be seated. Well, many will remember when the Super Duper Looper came out and how exciting it was to go on a ride that turned you upside down. Now that I'm a little bit older, I'm not sure I'm so excited about that. But I do remember people's fascination, or I'm interested in people's fascination with being turned upside down. As we raised our children, especially when they were toddlers, I sensed that they would take delight if we scooped them up and turned them upside down and played with them in ways that kind of changed their orientation. That worked most times unless it was too close to the feeding of mushed up peas. Then it wasn't so good for everybody. Or I think of elementary school, how everyone gravitated to those monkey bars, and what did they do on those monkey bars? But they hook their knees on them and they hang upside down. Or yoga instructors will tell you the benefits of doing inversions where you're getting the blood flow going differently. Or engineer professor will tell the students if you get stuck on a solution that you can't figure out, take a break, come back, look at a different angle, turn it upside down to increase your problem-solving capability. This morning, I want to celebrate the beauty of utter foolishness, of seeing the world through an upside-down kingdom way of seeing that Jesus shared with his followers. Did you hear his words in the Beatitudes? Lifting up blessings that would make us wonder, those who mourn, those who are merciful, meek. But this is Jesus' way. Words of his that echo back to the prophets of the Old Testament who would say, don't forget the widow and the orphan and the need to care for those around. Or the calling forth of Israel was to be a light for the nations, a servant to the nations. This upside-down way of seeing the world. And we hear it not only in Jesus' teachings, but in our focus text for this morning, which comes from the letter of 1 Corinthians that Paul wrote. Now, we're a couple of weeks into a series on 1 Corinthians, the book that is probably best known for the love chapter, chapter 13. Love is patient, love is kind, all that good stuff that we hear at weddings and in other instances. In addition to that, there's lots of other great stuff in 1 Corinthians that we have been mining these past couple of weeks. 2 weeks ago, we heard how Paul started this letter when he said, "I give thanks to God for you," and the gratitude for being called into Christian community. And last week, we heard of the call to unity in the midst of that community, learning that whether you say potato or potato, tomato or tomato, God takes and blends together our different personalities and perspectives and marinates them in the love of Christ so that we can be one in mission. And today, as we turn our attention to what Paul writes in this letter to the Corinthians, we celebrate the beauty of utter foolishness, or rather divine foolishness. As he says, the world sees preaching the cross as foolish, but we who are being saved know it as the power of God. Now, in our Thursday and Wednesday Bible studies, we've been looking at the book of Proverbs. And the book of Proverbs does a great job of lifting up the dichotomies of wise behavior and godly behavior and foolish behavior. And we had fun brainstorming in that group characters that we've seen on screen that would epitomize the foolish end of the spectrum. You know, we were thinking of characters like the Three Stooges, or Homer Simpson, or Kramer from Seinfeld, or whatever show that you're familiar with. It was easy to name those kind of foolish behaviors, but it was harder for us to reflect on how we enter into sometimes those moments of foolish behavior. Now, in this letter to the Corinthians, Paul uses that word, foolish, moria, from which we get the word moronic. But he applies it not to our wrongful, our simple ways, but rather Paul talks about proclaiming Christ crucified that seems foolish to the world. So it begs the question, well, how does the world define wisdom and power? What do the eyes of the world focus upon when we think of success? We know that the world focuses on influence and power, and might makes right. It reflects the reality that we experience from very young on, that there's always a measuring stick, it seems, that the world is putting out, whether it's grades or promotions, or in the world of social media, how many likes, how many friends. And one commentator talked about how this pressure of the world's view seductively tempts us to begin to ignore relationships, to treat people as commodities rather than caring for them so that we can achieve the next notch on the ruler of success. But Jesus says to this way of seeing the world that God's kingdom is different, that God's kingdom turns it upside down, that God's kingdom seeks out those who are not included and brings them in. You might hear the world say, compete with everyone around you. But Jesus and the topsy-turvy kingdom says, cooperate and find ways to work together. The world might say to you, keep up the frenetic pace so you can get ahead. But Jesus and the topsy-turvy kingdom says to you, pause to pray and get perspective. The focus of the world around us and the culture around us says focus on what you want and go for it. But the topsy-turvy kingdom says focus on what your neighbor needs and be a part of that. Jesus' teachings in the Beatitudes upending our perspectives. And it's echoed, as I mentioned earlier, in the words of the prophets, even in what we heard from Micah this morning. What does God require of us but to love kindness and do justice and walk humbly with our God? So let's take a look at these three areas of this countercultural way of being. Whereas the world would tell you survival of the fittest and you need to crush all the competition, Jesus and the kingdom invites us to look for ways to be a part of cooperation. And that's where lasting peace and well-being comes from. You know, it's interesting. I facilitate an interfaith book discussion group, every other month, and we gathered recently, and in that group, we sit in a circle, and the last time we gathered, I invited people to bring from their traditions, different traditions, their favorite verse or verses. And so some brought verses from the Quran, and some brought verses from the Hebrew Scripture, and some brought verses from the Kabbalah, and some brought verses from the New Testament, and all kinds of different sacred writings. But as we shared around that circle, we realized the sense of community that we share, sacredness for life, the dignity of one another, and the desire to do good in the world around us. The world may say compete and crush all the competition, but the topsy-turvy kingdom invites us to find ways to cooperate. Or the world may encourage you to not waste your time on something as outdated as religion or prayer. Rather, maximize your potential. The world says, keep up the frenetic pace, but the kingdom says, pause to pray. Find peace in your place. Discover what God made you for. And this is what Philip Yancey would lift up. I've been reading a book that he wrote called Why Pray? And I went to the Hallmark recently and I was buying some stuff, and as I had this book with me, so I put the book down on the counter as I was getting out my wallet to do the transaction, and the woman who was helping me looked at the book and looked up at me and said, "I say, why not?" And I was surprised to have a receptive response to an invitation to pause and pray. Philip Yancey in this book talks about living in Colorado and loving to be outdoors and a mountain climber, and one time being on a mountain and seeing a storm on a nearby mountain and a flash of lightning, and how it reminded him of why he takes time to pray. He says, "I, through my prayer, get a glimpse of my true state, a helpless, two-legged creature perched on the skin of this molten planet. I live in daily hope of getting my life together and under control. At home, I left a desk covered with to-do lists, like study the manual for our printer, or unclog the pine needles from the gutter, or unstick the toilet yet again, or change the snow tires, or check on my sick neighbor. Maybe if I take a day off," he writes, "I'll have the time." But then on the mountain, one bolt of lightning splitting a rock on a nearby peak explodes against my eardrums and exposes any illusion that I am ever in control. I can count on the moment before me and nothing more. The psalmist prayed, "Let me know how fleeting my life is." A mountain storm thunderously answers that prayer for me, and the priorities of my life crack apart and slide back into place. The world and the culture around us tells us to focus on what you want. But the topsy-turvy, upside-down kingdom view says, focus on what your neighbor needs. From time to time, our children bring home the scholastic news sheet that's used in their reading class to talk about what's happening in the world and current events. And I was moved as we read together recently about a young girl named Dania, 11 years old, the same age as our oldest daughter. Not long ago, this reading says, Dania was a regular kid like you. She and her family lived in a comfortable home in Syria. Her backyard garden had flowers that bloomed and olive trees and grapevines. She loved being with her friends and going to school. She was proud of the gold stars she earned for completing her homework on time. And then it goes on to detail how 5 years ago war erupted in their country, and how 3 years ago the war came so close to her village that her family was faced with the choice of stay and risk being killed or flee and leave everything behind. And they fled. And now Dania and her family are one of the 65 million refugees in our world one of the greatest numbers in all of history. She and her family went from refugee camp to refugee camp until about a year ago they landed in Lebanon, a country the size of Connecticut that has now welcomed 1 million refugees. She's living in a garage of someone's home there. No heat, but at least running water. And yet, her first couple of weeks there, her hopes of returning to school were dashed as she learned that Lebanon just couldn't absorb all those children into their school districts. Until a nonprofit organization called Save the Children came along and decided to open a school in the Akkar province of Lebanon. And Dania applied and was one of 200 students to be admitted into that school. And so now she lives again with hope for the future. How did this kindness and this upheaval affect her? She was asked at the end of the article, Dania, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she responded by saying this, I hope to become a doctor. I will get to wear a nice white outfit and a stethoscope around my neck. And I won't take any money from the poor, but will treat them all for free. Jesus said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They will be filled. He lifted up these upending, upside-down kingdom world views, not to just say that God is better than you or bigger than you, but to say that God has come near to you. For God did not wait for us to fulfill the law perfectly, to get it all together, to finish our to-do lists. God came to us through the cross. And so let the world call it foolishness. I will call it the power and the healing of God. And now to him who is able to accomplish abundantly beyond all we could ask or imagine, to him be glory now and forever. Amen.